From the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, USA, this is the Space Dog Radio Show. I'm the Space Dog, along with independent journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, thanks for joining us again at Space Dog Radio.
Thanks for having me on the show again, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. So you've got some news from under the radar. Let's start out with GMOs, GMO labeling and Initiative 522 here in Washington State. What's going on with that?
Well, there's an initiative drive that it's called Initiative 522, and it would call for the labeling of all genetically modified organisms in food in the state. So it would be sort of a way of trying to successfully do what California failed to do, which was just give the consumers the right to know what they're buying, which you'd think would be sort of a civil rights issue, but apparently we are years behind Europe, which has been labeling GMOs and pretty much down on GMOs for years now. But in the United States of America, we do not have the right to know whether our food is genetically modified or not. So that means you don't know when you're buying food at a major chain store whether it's genetically modified organisms in it. Just your fruit and your produce, a lot of times is genetically modified and they're not labeled that way. So recent success in Europe on that issue, the recent failure in California where that initiative failed, and some would say largely due to a big lobbying effort by GMO companies. But here in Washington State, we have a chance to once again sort of be the leader for the nation on an issue that's really important to people around the world. And speaking of that, actually, a very well-known GMO or anti-GMO activist, an organic seed activist, is coming to Seattle this week, and her name is Dr. Vandana Shiva. She's an amazing Indian activist and has led this campaign to create organic food or organic seed banks for farmers in India so that they're not dependent upon the GMO seeds that Monsanto and other companies have been pushing there.
Right.
So those two issues are sort of tying together this week in Seattle. So it's a good time for her to be here. And once again, like I said, Washington State seems to be taking the lead on an issue that the rest of the country hasn't been able to deal with yet.
So, Mark, just to fill our listeners in who are not familiar with the importance of GMO labeling, could you kind of talk about that a little bit and who the primary people are that are fighting this initiative?
Well, one thing that most people don't know is that San Juan County in Washington State is the first county in the United States to actually ban the growing of genetically modified organisms. That's what GMO stands for. And, if you go to a website called yeson522.com, there's a whole series of news updates about farmers around the country and around the world who have had real issues with using genetically modified organisms. They tend to infiltrate other fields which are organic, and then all of a sudden, there's a mixing of the genes. There's problems with insects that react really badly to the genetically modified organisms or to the pollen from them. And so in India and lots of other places in the world, it's become a huge issue. In the United States, we haven't really dealt with it. There are also studies that the activists on this campaign are promoting as evidence that there are serious health effects associated with consuming genetically modified organisms.
Mark, there's some really interesting movies out that have been out for a long time, specifically about Monsanto and how they strong-arm farmers and have their genetically modified seeds put into farmland, and then if the farmers don't want that, then they try to strong-arm them in it. It's a big corporate deal, and those are the lobbies that are really washing around over Iowa, throughout Kansas, across the Midwest. The big farming countries are heavily affected by this GMO push by the big corporations. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, and it goes back to the copywriting of biological organisms, which was controversial in the beginning. But these huge corporations now own the copyright to produce these genetically modified organisms, and in one particularly frightening case, that's why they call a lot of this stuff Frankenfood, by the way, is that there is this Terminator seed project, which I've heard about, which apparently the seed does not, the plant does not produce more seeds. So you would have to go back to the corporation to get your seeds. That way farmers would not be able to grow seeds without buying them from places like Monsanto. So one of the things that Dr. Vandana Shiva did was set up food banks all over India, or excuse me, seed banks all over India, where the farmers can get organic seeds which will produce, which means they don't have to go back and make repeated buys from these corporations in order to grow their food. But it was also sold years ago as part of the, quote, green revolution. There were some scientists who decided that they could feed more people in the world and avoid starvation and famine by using genetically modified organisms. And what the activists are saying on this campaign is that there hasn't been enough research or study to really prove whether the stuff is dangerous or not. And so people really need to make the choice themselves. They need to be able to look at the food and decide for themselves whether they want to consume genetically modified organisms or not. As the laws are now, the supermarket you go to doesn't have to tell you whether there's GMO food product in anything that it sells. So as a consumer, you're missing out on a real choice. Now, a lot of people go to organic food markets or farmers markets and or their local, food co-op or something and find ways of getting organic food. In Seattle, it's pretty readily available for some people, but it tends to be more expensive. And so a lot of the issue is economic, too, which means that lower economic folks on that scale end up having to go to, and buy cheap food that is full of GMOs, which the activists would say actually leads to a lot of health problems. And then you have the whole issue with lack of health care, and, so it leads to other chaos in society is basically what they're saying.
Right, and so this time of year, I strongly advise my friends and family to visit their local farms and to look for that non-GMO and/or organic labeling and talk to the farmers and maybe even connect with some specific farms that do not use this GMO altered seed so that they can stay healthy and eat the right foods.
I don't think there's any doctors in the country that I know who would disagree with you that that's a good idea. I mean, most doctors will tell you that fresh produce is much better for you than, something out of your own garden or straight off the farm is always going to be better than something that's been shipped halfway across the world or the country to your supermarket.
Right.
Regardless of whether it's GMO or not.
So what's the time frame on this 522 initiative then? What's next?
They're trying to get enough signatures to put it on the November ballot here. And so far, the last I heard is they had something like 500,000 or some crazy number. Don't quote me on that. It's pretty easy.
You're already quoted.
Yeah, well, I could look it up right now because I'm looking at their website, but it has to do with, you have to get a certain number of signatures on an initiative, which is a pretty cool thing to have an initiative process. Actually, it allows the populace, the voters, to decide for themselves if they want a new law or not. That's how we got legal recreational use of marijuana in Washington State and also same-sex marriage. So this is another effort by the people, basically, that sort of bypass, the political representatives to get it on the ballot. If they get enough signatures, then the state will be able to vote on it in November. And if it passes during the general election, then that means that there will actually be a chance that folks in Washington State will reclaim, one of the consumers' rights that was taken away many, many years ago. And, of course, I'm sure the activists are thinking that that would be really good for the rest of the country to sort of show that it can be done.
Right.
So they might set a precedent is what they're thinking. In California, they were not successful with that. So somebody else has to pick up the ball and run with it now, I guess.
Absolutely. Yes on 522.com. We'll put a link on spacedogradio.com, and you can go ahead and check that out. Tonight, President Obama is going to make his case to go to war with Syria based on the recent gas attacks on civilians. And there have been limited reports actually under the radar about all the protests that have been going on. But in fact, they've been going on all across the country and strongly in the Pacific Northwest. What do you have under the radar about that?
Well, there is a website for that as well that folks can get the latest updates on the numbers of protests that have been happening around the world. But the latest was 382 since that have been scheduled at least, or actually already held since August 29th. And that stretches around the globe from Kuala Lumpur to Hollywood, California. I mean, it's everywhere. Tokyo, Seattle, Brazil. It's just an international sort of series of protests. It's obviously not a popular idea around the rest of the world. And according to the latest opinion polls in our country, in the United States, it's not a very popular idea here. But it seems, from talking to some political consultants, that the folks in Washington, D.C. have a different kind of agenda. So there's a lot of politics going on there. And part of the way it was explained to me is that President Obama would like the support of the Congress on this vote, because a lot of his supporters feel that if they don't get the support on this vote, then they will also fail to get support for Obamacare and all sorts of other programs that the president has been pushing for the last 2 terms. So it might be kind of confusing to some people why folks in Washington, D.C. are pushing this idea, but there are a lot of political influences that maybe the average person isn't aware of that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. But bottom line, 382 protests around the world, that's a pretty good indication that it's not a popular idea at this point. And also, we should mention that earlier today, there were news reports about a potential agreement that the Syrian government could make with the Russians to allow international control of their chemical weapons. And if something like that is able to happen, there's a possibility that the administration may not call for an intervention at that point. It remains to be seen.
Well, it's all very interesting, the timing of that announcement from Russia just before the president goes on national television and tries to make the call to the American people and the Congress for war with Syria. And, I never thought I would agree with the Russians so much as I do now. It's absolutely the right thing to do. Diplomacy and humanitarian efforts need to be exhausted, and all the research has to be done before we start shooting rockets off. And that's just this space dog's opinion. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree.
No, I think that everyone can agree, whether you're whatever part of the political spectrum you're on, that what we really want is if we want peace in Syria. I mean, that's what these protests are about. Some of them are actually billing themselves as, peace protests. So what they want is the killing to stop on all sides. In other words, they don't want more U.S. intervention in another place in the world, because that will cause more casualties, both civilian and military. But it's also the idea that, the best of both worlds would be to stop what's happening there without creating another war for the United States, because people are pretty tired of, Panama, Grenada, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Right.
But another thing that folks should remember that I don't hear being talked about is that the issue of Syria is not a new issue, and people were talking about this a year ago. I mean, there's been discussion of this going on for a long time. It's just that it's become politically important, and the media is now focusing on it. But we witnessed the same thing with the Afghanistan war, where it just completely dropped off the radar for years.
Right.
And, so people, if you look back, you'll find that there are people discussing this issue for a long time, not just a recent issue.
Mark, you have anything coming up that you want to tell folks about, either this coming weekend or in the next couple of days?
Well, I look forward to sharing my experiences with Dr. Vandana Shiva, because it's somebody that a lot of folks, not only in India but in this country, really admire when it comes to these kinds of issues we talked about. But there's also the first ever International Livestream Congress happening this weekend in Toronto, Canada, although it's happening online as well, so anybody around the world can participate. And there will be a series of workshops and teach-ins and presentations about live streaming, and I've been asked to give a presentation about freedom of the press and the importance of live streamers to the new media, which, as a journalist, I have to say, it has really changed my world, because I'll get a Twitter feed from someone that will direct me to a live stream of something that's happening halfway across the world, and and it will allow me to cover it as a journalist in the United States without ever getting close to the area. So I think it's an amazing thing that's happening in the world. I always say, the teenager on the skateboard with a cell phone that can take photos and video is now a journalist. So that's the world we've entered. Unfortunately, the corporate mainstream media doesn't seem to want to admit that, although they spend a lot of time stealing stories free from bloggers and other folks. But it's the new world that we're in, and it's really good to see that people are coming together on an international basis to really, push this technology and find out what can be done with it.
The first ever international live stream Congress out of Toronto this coming weekend. Thanks for that insight, Mark Taylor-Canfield. We will put a link on spacedogradio.com, and obviously we'll send a bunch of information to our listeners about you, Mark, and all the places you are, including Huffington Post. And I know you're been on across the board some very interesting media outlets. Mark Taylor-Canfield, independent journalist, thank you for joining us on Space Dog Radio. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for keeping up the good work, and I look forward to talking to you again. See you soon.
All right, Mark Taylor-Canfield, independent journalist. We'll put a link on spacedogradio.com so you can check them out. Space Dog Radio, your remote location radio station. You can catch us on spacedogradio.com 24/7 around the planet and throughout the universe. You can also find us on Twitter at Space Dog Radio. From someplace over the beautiful Pacific Northwest, USA, this has been the Space Dog Radio Show. Thank you for listening. Be safe, be happy, and I'll catch you next orbit.